Oftentimes when people engage in historical revisionism, it's not because they've discovered some fact that's truly perplexing to them. It's because they've got some thought or idea or moral belief right now that requires them to rewrite the past in order to make the present more acceptable. All the revisionism that you hear is always stuff that somehow conveniently ties to what's going on today. It always has to be that way, because the revisionism isn't born out of any sort of historical analysis. It's always born out of the need to justify or grant some, moral claim to something going on today.
It's obviously the case that dishonest actors can make up or distort historical facts to advance a lie. Many Israelis and Palestinians do it all the time. But what the controversial left-wing streamer Destiny does not yet seem to realize is that technically everyone is a historical revisionist. And people like Daryl Cooper actually make some important points. What you have to understand is that there is no such thing as an objective account of history, because there's no such thing as an objective account of anything.
Well, people say, well, the person on the other side of the ideological continuum has different opinions than I do. It's like, no, they don't. Or maybe they do. But they don't see the same facts, because the filter they use to select from among the infinite number of available facts preferentially presents them with the facts that are relevant to them. And so one of the horrible things about political discussions is that you're actually having a discussion about what the facts are. And you say, well, the facts are the same for everyone. It's like, yeah. It's like saying, I have an infinite library of books, and you can come into it. It's like, well, you're going to pick out the same book? It seems highly improbable. And that's the problem with facts. It's like, there's a lot of them.
This infinite library thought experiment is so goddamn useful it's hard to articulate. It helps us identify a fundamental flaw that plagues many people on the left and the right. For example, conservative opponents of critical race theory will endlessly repeat something to the effect of, don't teach my kids propaganda, just teach them the facts. But here's the problem.
Which facts are you going to pick? How are you going to select them? There's an infinite number of them, even in a constrained situation. So merely by attending to some and not attending to others, you're already using an ethic.
Why exactly do most Americans watching this know all about the Boston Massacre, in which a total of 5 people died, but almost no Americans watching this know anything about the Cambodian genocide, in which 3 million people died? It's not because the Boston Massacre is objectively more historically significant, clearly it's not. It's because any telling of history necessarily excludes an infinite amount of potentially relevant facts. We don't study history to get an objective account of the past. We study history so we can tell stories and narratives that have pragmatic utility today.
All the revisionism that you hear is always stuff that somehow conveniently ties to what's going on today. It's always born out of the need to justify or grant some, moral claim to something going on today.
And this is why it's beyond foolish to believe anyone who tells you there's a clear objective truth about any period in history.
Which is one of the big things I argue for Israel-Palestine. The reason why that history is so contested is because a lot of the moral claims that both sides make today about how their conduct is rooted in their historical, telling of events.
You try to do something like untangle the Israel-Palestine conflict. I mean, one of the things you just to start with is like, okay, how far back are you going to go? Well, I would say it depends on what argument you want to make. If you want to make argument A, you go back 100 years. If you want to make argument B, you go back 3,000 years. And then you could have an argument about which time scale you should use, but it's not like it's obvious. Is it 10 years? Is it 1 year? Is it 6 months? It's not 3,000 years. Is it 2,999 years? Where are the borders of relevancy when you're laying out the landscape of the argument?
All accounts of history are motivated by the pragmatic utility those stories provide today. And the most important stories, by any reasonable standard, are the stories that facilitate large-scale social cooperation among human beings. The stories at the base of civilization, what we call mythologies. Why do we study the Boston Massacre and not the Cambodian genocide? Because the Boston Massacre is part of the broader American mythology that we use to orient our values. The Constitution wouldn't be sacred if there wasn't a mythology around it. And whether you're a Daily Wire shill, a globalist transhumanist, or a secret Nazi apologist, no one disputes the overwhelming political significance of these unifying stories.
We see the world of facts through something that when described as a story, because we have to prioritize our perceptions, we have to prioritize facts. And as far as I can tell, a story is a verbal account of how of how our perceptions and the facts that we encounter are prioritized.
If you examine any large-scale human corporation, you always find fiction as its basis. It's a fictional story that holds lots of strangers together.
And whenever you have a historical event that is mythologized, and when I say that, I don't mean myth like that's a myth, that's a lie. That's not what I mean. I mean that it's a formative part of how we all understand the world we're in, or at least officially, like the official world, like that.
Yeah, the structures we live in.
Structures we live in. It's the justification for a lot of those structures, right?
So now that you understand that the history that you've learned is definitely not objective, but simply part of a broader mythology, and there is no objective truth about any given historical period, it's time to get to the uncomfortable part of the video. The point that Daryl Cooper is correct about is that American mythology very clearly biases itself towards a telling of history in which the United States are the archetypal good guys. And that is clearly not the case. You do not have to be an ideologically possessed critical race theorist to acknowledge that the United States, like all countries, makes decisions that serve its geopolitical interests more so than the pursuit of justice. Obviously, those two things can align, like when we beat the shit out of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but we also allied with the Soviet Union to do it, who were objectively worse than either Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. And given what the United States did in Dresden, or with the firebombing of Tokyo, or the pardoning of literally the most horrible human beings on the face of the planet,
Read about Unit 731. That was a Japanese medical unit in China. You read about Unit 731 and then come and tell me you don't believe hell is real.
it's clear that we're better than Nazis, but that doesn't mean we're the good guys. It's sort of like the Imperium of Man in Warhammer 40k. Are they better than Chaos? Yes. Does that make them the good guys? No. I am not saying that the United States should not operate in its geopolitical interests, and even though I very much disagree with the United States getting involved in more foreign wars, I would be lying if I did not acknowledge that there are perfectly reasonable arguments for providing military aid to Ukraine or Israel. But what I will not do is waste my time entertaining these pseudo-moralistic arguments about how the United States is maintaining a moral, rules-based liberal order or supporting democracy in the Middle East, especially when the evidence for those claims seems increasingly weak.
But Israel identifies as a Western democracy.
Oh, really?
It's a Western country supported by the U.S.
Thank you so much for telling me what Israel identifies as. That's fabulous. Do me a favor. Don't sell me that old line like, we're the only democracy in the Middle East. Like, we have some Western elements. We have some democratic elements in our country, but this is a Middle East country that needs to survive in the Middle East. Also, we're not an American-style country since we are not a democracy for all its people, but a national ethnic state. So therefore, we're much more like Middle East countries. Okay. This is a region. I'm not here to be way better than the Arabs. That's a total like American Jewish like mythology that has been created. That's not my attitude at all. My attitude is survival. I'm here to survive, and I'm here to push back against bad guys.
The point that I am making is not that we should ignore objective historical facts. Facts exist, and it's important to be as educated as possible about what really happened in the past. The point that I am making is that no matter how many facts you acquire, you will never be able to assemble those facts into anything approaching an objective historical account. Instead, you should look at the deeper, underlying psychological patterns that motivate the very histories that we concern ourselves with. As the British feminist Annie Besant said, a myth is far truer than a history, for a history only gives a story of the shadows, whereas a myth gives a story of the substances that cast the shadows. In other words, archetypes, baby. Until next time, good luck and Godspeed.